A truce agreement for the besieged city of Aleppo. The Syrian military confirms a 48-hour ceasefire in the city brokered by Washington and Moscow. And that ceasefire has already taken effect, although there are still reports of fighting. Meanwhile, talks getting underway in Berlin. Germany's foreign minister is meeting with his French counterpart, the UN Special Envoy to Syria, and members of Syria's opposition group. CCTV's Guy Henderson is following it all for us. He is live in Berlin. Guy, update us on this meeting. What happened?
Well, going into this meeting, the UN Special Envoy, Staffan de Mistura, made very clear that just bringing about, trying to reinforce that cessation of hostilities was going to be the priority of this meeting. Now that we've got these reports that an agreement of sorts has, at least in principle, been reached, well, that might well have freed up the discussions to ask around the next question, which is, of course, getting humanitarian aid in. Even earlier in this same day, we'd heard from the Special Envoy's number 2 talking about how the Syrian government had only granted the UN 25% of its requests for access to humanitarian aid in various parts of Syria, something that he said was unique in any conflict taking place anywhere in the world at the moment. Also potentially complicating that situation, the Turkish border. The Russian government has in recent days called for that border to be closed because it's concerned about the flow of weapons over the border, but the UN is saying that that must remain open so that humanitarian aid can continue to flow. Another potential discussion point during these talks, I think, will have been the situation for detainees. Both sides want detainees to be released from prisons inside Syria. Emerging from those talks, just a very brief statement from de Mistura, who said that despite this agreement, Aleppo was still the key, and that any alternative, he said, would be catastrophic.
Guy, what about confidence when it comes to this latest agreement? Certainly the cessation of hostilities reached for other parts of Syria. That didn't hold too well. What about for this one?
Well, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, in the build-up to this ceasefire, or to this deal, which, as you say, kicked in just after midnight, the observatory was reporting that this was the fighting taking place in Aleppo was some of the fiercest that had taken place in that city for more than a year. So a very tense situation there. And the reports since this ceasefire, this agreement has been reached, are that the violence has been reduced but hasn't stopped entirely. And it was interesting to note from this meeting here in Berlin an announcement from the French foreign minister that he would be convening a meeting of countries that back the Syrian opposition group, the main Syrian opposition groups in France, in Paris next week, because he said he could not gather or could not persuade parties to gather for a international Syrian support group meeting. Now, it might just be that the ISSG is waiting to see what happens with this cessation of hostilities, but it's on a tight timeline because even in the last 24 hours or so, the US Secretary of State, John Kerry, has been saying that they are still looking to try and implement a transition as soon as possible. Just listen here.
I've said that before. I have said it to President Putin. I've said it to others. It will not hold unless there is a bona fide effort to put in place a transition. And we are getting into the period, folks. Minister Lavrov and I stood up in Moscow, and we said that the target date for the transition is the 1st of August. So we're now coming up to May. So either something happens in these next few months, or they are asking for a very different track.
Now, one of the things that de Mistura has tried to hit home again and again in the last few weeks and days is that he wants to try and restart peace talks this month in May, which is partly why he's been on this tour to Moscow. He's had Secretary of State Kerry to Geneva, and why he's been here in Berlin. But he said that the key to those talks restarting was reducing the violence. So we've got an agreement. There is some hope, but I think everyone will be waiting to see what happens.
Hope is certainly a good start. CCTV's Guy Henderson live for us in Berlin. Thank you.